gentleman was dispatched was a vessel of 50 oars, each manned by 7 men. They were seated upon a sort of staircase that followed the slope of the oar, running from the gangway in the vessel's middle down to the shallow bulwarks. The place allotted to Sir Oliver was that next to the gangway. Here, stark naked as when he was born, he was chained to the bench, and in those chains, let us say at once, he remained, without a single moment's intermission, for 6 whole months. Between himself and the hard timbers of his seat there was naught but a flimsy and dirty sheepskin. From end to end the bench was not more than 10 feet in length, whilst the distance separating it from the next one was a bare 4 feet. In that cramped space of 10 feet by 4, Sir Oliver and his 6 oar-mates had their miserable existence, waking and sleeping, for they slept in their chains at the oar without sufficient room in which to lie and stretch. Anon Sir Oliver became hardened and inured to that unspeakable existence, that living death of the galley slave. But that first long voyage to Naples was ever to remain the most terrible experience of his life. For spells of 6 or 8 endless hours at a time, and on one occasion for no less than 10 hours, did he pull at his oar without a single moment's pause. With one foot on the stretcher, the other on the bench in front of him, grasping his part of that appallingly heavy 15-foot oar, he would bend his back to thrust forward and upwards so to clear the shoulders of the groaning, sweating slaves in front of him. Then he would lift the end so as to bring the blade down to the water, and having gripped, he would rise from his seat to throw his full weight into the pull, and so fall back with clank of chain upon the groaning bench to swing forward once more, and so on until his senses reeled, his sight became blurred, his mouth parched, and his whole body a living, straining ache. Then would come the sharp, fierce cut of the boatswain's whip to revive energies that flagged however little, and sometimes to leave a bleeding stripe upon his naked back. Thus day in and day out, now broiled and blistered by the pitiless southern sun, now chilled by the night dews whilst he took his cramped and unrefreshing rest, indescribably filthy and dishevelled, his hair and beard matted with endless sweat, unwashed save by the rains which in that season were all too rare, choked almost by the stench of his miserable comrades and infested with filthy crawling things begotten of decaying sheepskins and heaven alone knows what other foulness of that floating hell. He was sparingly fed upon weevil biscuit, and to drink he was given lukewarm water that was often stale, saving that sometimes, when the spell of rowing was more than usually protracted, the boatswains would thrust lumps of bread sodden in wine into the mouths of the toiling slaves to sustain them. The scurvy broke out on that voyage, and there were other diseases among the rowers, to say nothing of the festering sores begotten of the friction of the bench, which were common to all, and which each must endure as best he could. With the slave whose disease conquered him, or who, reaching the limit of his endurance, permitted himself to swoon, the boatswains had a short way. The diseased were flung overboard. The swooning were dragged out upon the gangway or bridge and flogged there to revive them. If they did not revive, they were flogged on until they were a horrid bleeding pulp, which was then heaved into the sea. Once or twice, when they stood to windward, the smell of the slaves being wafted abaft and reaching the fine gilded poop where the Infanta and her attendants travelled, the helmsmen were ordered to put about, and for long, weary hours the slaves would hold the galley in position, backing her up gently against the wind so as not to lose way. The number that died in the first week of that voyage amounted to close upon a quarter of the total, but there were reserves in the prow, and these were drawn upon to fill the empty places. None but the fittest could survive this terrible ordeal. Of these was Sir Oliver, and of these too was his immediate neighbour at the oar, a stalwart, powerful, impassive, uncomplaining young Moor, who accepted his fate with a stoicism that aroused Sir Oliver's admiration. For days they exchanged no single word together, their religions marking them out, they thought, for enemies, despite